You are in love, but something's not quite right. Even with a twinge of worry, you can't wait to see her in the dim of the ferryboat lights. Fairy lights in the night, so subdued. Lazy tides splash the sides, going to my rendezvous. Moonbeams search their path through restless clouds to their mark on the shimmering waterway. Lead me to my love, guide me from above. Get me back to her. Let the time go fast, for how much longer can I last? The purring sound of the engine's drone, I feel it pulling me to her. This love, will it endure in the dim of the fairy lights? Fairy lights, fairy lights. There, I see her on the dock in the dim of the fairy lights. The Ferryboat Lights that I just sang also was inspired from that same Defusky Island in South Carolina. And this, in some bizarre kind of fashion, since because there was a lot of trees there, did remind me of another story of a 35-year-old professional tree worker who had been working out in Olney, Maryland, and he was experienced, but in cutting down a limb, a heavy limb actually fell on his head, causing him to immediately lose consciousness. So again, in those days, this was about 1975, 1976, there was no MRI or CAT scan neurodiagnostic study. So I was called and I raced out there, and I found in the emergency room the fellow who was lying on the floor. On my examination, he was quite ill. He wasn't moving at all, and then when I examined him, I noticed that the left pupil was dilated and fixed. In other words, when you shone a light into the eye, there was no movement whatsoever of the pupil of the iris. So that was one thing. Furthermore, on the right side of his head, what I noticed was that there was there was a big bruise, a fresh bruise the size of a pancake on the side of the right side of his head. Before I did anything else, I examined him, saw this bruise, and then I felt that there was a chance that he may have something called an acute epidural hematoma. And the way this happens is that in your skull, there's a blood vessel that goes up through your skull called the middle meningeal artery. And I felt that there must have been a fracture of his skull across this middle meningeal artery, which let this high pressure arterial blood out, which then pressed onto the outside of his brain, but underneath his skull. It's called an epidural hematoma, and you must get to it within a very short period of time, usually less than an hour, in order to save somebody's life. I did order the X-ray of his head, and it showed this fracture, this linear fracture going right through the path of where this artery was. Therefore, in those days, even at that hospital, they didn't have a lot of neurosurgical instrumentation. So I had invested a lot of money at that time of myself for neurosurgical instrumentation for just such occasions in peripheral hospitals that didn't provide a lot of neurosurgical equipment or care. So I did make a straight incision about 2 inches long above his ear, and then spread the scalp apart, went down to his skull, and then took a tree fine, which I had in the trunk of my car, It was already sterilized, and I brought that out and drilled a hole in his skull about this big, in other words, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches wide. And with opening the skull and then opening one of the layers around the skull, around the brain, it's called the meninges, which means covering. This one's called the dura mater, or the hard cover, the most outer layer. This is where this torn vessel was. The torn vessel goes through this dura mater, and it was ripped during the fracture of his skull. So I was able then to, number one, open the covering, take out the blood clot, and then secure with coagulation of the torn vessel and stop the bleeding. Almost immediately after removing the clot, the man woke up and sat up right in the emergency room saying, "Where am I? Where am I?" And he did just fine. But it shows just the nature of what can happen in some of these neurosurgical situations. Another type of common intracranial or head blood clot is called a chronic subdural hematoma. I mentioned before, the brain is surrounded by something called meninges, which means coverings. And there's 3 of these coverings. There's an outer layer called the dura mater, which means hard mother. Then there's something called the arachnoid, which looks like a spider's web, which is a very thin cellophane-like covering. And then underneath that, there's something called the pia mare, which means soft mother, which the blood vessels are embedded and they feed right into the brain. That's how the brain gets nurtured. Anyway, particularly with senior citizens, as the brain ages, it atrophies, so it gets smaller. Now, in the normal circulation of the brain, blood gets into the brain, that's oxygenated blood, but then when it goes to leave, it's venous blood that's deoxygenated. But the way it leaves the brain is from what's called bridging veins that attach from the brain to the major sinuses, blood sinuses, that are at the top of the brain. Now, these vessels can be on a stretch sometimes, and they can tear somewhat easily if you just have a slight hit on your head or if you another fall or whatever. Anyway, they can tear, and blood can leak out slowly. Now, if it's a major tear and blood leaks out very quickly, then you can have an acute subdural hematoma, which is incredibly dangerous. But if blood leaks out just slowly, it can leak out and then sort of stop, and when it stops, then membranes are formed around this blood that's accumulated, and then it can leak again, and another clot can form with more membranes. So you can have something called multiloculated subdural hematomas. Well, I saw this 102-year-old man that came into the hospital, in the emergency room over at Holy Cross Hospital. And he was in pretty good shape, except for complaining of headaches. And at this time, we did have our MRIs and everything else. And I did the study, and I saw these multiloculated bilateral collections of subdural fluid. In other words, the fluid was underneath the covering, the dura. So I explained to the patient that there were these bilateral collections of blood, each one offsetting the other one, so that there wasn't pressure on one side of the brain that would cause what we call a herniation, but there was pressure on both sides, which sort of equalized everything up until a certain point. Well, he was getting close to that danger point, and I told him that these had to be evacuated. I also mentioned to him that I usually don't operate on people over 100 years old, but in your case, I think I will. I said, but there's only one condition. He said, what's that? He said, I told him that I wanted to do the operation in an awake condition. He said, what? He said, I don't want to put you to sleep with anesthesia because at your age, I'm more concerned about the possible complications from your lungs from putting you to sleep. And this operation really doesn't hurt when you operate on the brain. I'll just use some local anesthetic on your skin, and that'll get us down to the skull, where I'll drill some of the skull away to be able to get to the clots. Are you willing to do that? He said, absolutely, I agree. So we take him to the operating room. I shaved his head, both sides of his head symmetrically, and then prepped and draped his head. In other words, prepped it so that I could still see his face and talk to him. I went ahead and made the incisions on both sides and made openings on both sides about the size of a silver dollar. And then as I'm doing the drilling, as a matter of fact, I said to him, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yes, Doc, and by the way, what you're doing sounds very interesting. Is there anything I can do to help you?" So I said, "As a matter of fact, you can. I'd like you to think of placing your head like in a swivel, turning it from side to side when I tell you to. And then each time I open the covering over these clots, I want you to cough a little bit, and then gravity and the natural forces will evacuate the blood clot from either side of your head." He said, "I'll gladly do it." So then, as we went ahead and proceeded that way, and back and forth, I would tilt his head and have him cough, tilt it back the other way and cough until we evacuated all the clots from both sides of his head. And then we irrigated it with what we call copious irrigation of antibiotic fluid, just to clean out any remnants that were there, and we're able to secure any other bleeding points with the bipolar coagulation forceps. He did very well after the operation, and actually even returned to driving in his normal life.